It's because part of biological intensification is bringing the human being back into the food production system with our labor, with our intellectual labor, our mind, our brilliance, and our work. There is nothing more fulfilling than being able to work with the land. And yet we have the ultimate ideology which makes it look like being on the land is the worst punishment, as a result of which we have this thinking right now of that people on the land have to be removed. Small farmers have to be targeted. It's the case for the United States, it's the case for India. And the WTO agreement says that very clearly. It talks about getting rid of surplus farmers. But you're down to less than 2%. And you're still surplus. When you're down to 0.2%, you'll still be surplus. Because once there is this idea of the empty earth, and there's the idea of the monoculture of the mind, then even a few is too many. Even a few family farms and a few small peasants are too many peasants. I have called this the biggest genocide of our times, because 3/4 of humanity makes its living farming. 3/4 of humanity today makes its living farming. Most of Africa, most of Asia, most of Latin America. And yet, by these new treaties, there is this targeted policy direction that basically says that farmers, small farmers, must go. India has had 30 to 40,000 farm suicides in the last 5 or 6 years, connected to increasing cost of production as the Monsantos create seed markets and falling prices linked to the trade treaties. Every year, our peasants are losing $26 billion of income. $26 billion, one country alone. We are 1/4 of the world's farmers. So if 1/4 is losing 26 billion, 100 billion is what peasants of the world are losing. That's 100 billion additional poverty of already impoverished people. This is what a genocide is. These are not suicides. Because when collectively 40,000 people are exterminated by design and by policy, according to the United Nations, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethical, racial, religious, or other group. Farmers as a group have been defined as a group that must be ethnically cleansed. They are a culture that produce food in sovereignty. That's their crime, that they defend freedom and autonomy of the last sphere, freedom of our food. And even though the other system is producing less food, worse food, at higher costs, I've noticed there's a new film on Walmart which says the high cost of low prices. One could say exactly the same for food, the high cost of cheap food. That cheap food is not cheap. It's not cheap for the earth, it's not cheap for the farmers, it's not cheap for our bodies. Whether you look at it from the ecological perspective or the social perspective or the health perspective or the ethical perspective, the treat we need to be giving ourselves is the treat of biodiversity cultivated sustainably on small farms to produce health, to produce livelihoods, and to be able to produce peace. Peace is something we always ignore in the agriculture issue, even though, as I mentioned in the beginning, Borlaug got a peace prize to create an agriculture that looks like war. Today we need to create a real agriculture of peace. And wherever farmers start to reclaim their identity as Earth's primary producers, there is no place for religious conflict. There is no place for ethnic conflict. That's why this year we have started in Kashmir, the heartland of some of our worst conflict right now, and the place where we've had a recent disaster with the earthquake. We've started there saving seeds as a peace issue. And now, of course, we are having to do food relief with the earthquake added, snow that's come 1 month too early, and therefore has finished off all the crops, and we are going to have to do massive rescue of biodiversity. We hope, I hope personally, and I hope many of you here, I know a series like this can only come out of breaking out of the monoculture of the mind. That just like Iowa has been at the center of exporting a global monoculture, it can now become the center of conserving the highest diversity, first at home, and allowing that diversity of culture and other species to be protected elsewhere. That's the peace agenda of the time, of our times. Without being able to respect diversity, celebrate it, and protect it vigorously, there is no chance for peace. And once we have diversity, we have everything else. We have the prosperity, we have the sustainability, we have the peace, we have the joy, we have the aesthetics, we have the real treat on this Halloween evening. Thank you.
On behalf of everybody here at Iowa State University, please join me in thanking Dr. Vandana Shiva for this wonderful lecture here. I would like to remind everybody that there is a reception after this lecture, and Dr. Shiva will also do a book signing. And in the meantime, if you have any questions for her, please come up to the microphone and she will be glad to answer them.
No question. Wait.
I mentioned this to you at dinner. There was a headline in the newspaper about Dr. Borlaug talked during his week of awards last month about the wheat rust, which is coming back. He said it had been gone for 50 years. They thought it was gone. And now the wheat rust in one kind of wheat. How does that affect monoculture? Where does that fit in?
Well, you know, the wheat rust that's actually come here now is called the Karnal Band. And it was introduced to India as a result of introducing the wheat monocultures of the Green Revolution. Monocultures, by their very nature, invite disease epidemics and pest epidemics, because when you have that level of uniformity, then you have the perfect appetite and the perfect ecological niche for the thriving of diseases. Now, the Karnal Band was introduced to India through the US-led Green Revolution, and it's now come back here as a huge destroyer of the wheat crop. Again, to deal with pests and to deal with disease epidemics, it's now recognized everywhere. Biodiversity is the only way to be able to cope with it, to break the increase of populations, to increase your beneficial species that control all this, to create diversity of niches and habitats by having diversity of crops. In the first year when we started our farm, we had the rust, we had the Karnal Band. By the second year, we had so much diversity that the diversity was taking care of it. We didn't have to do anything. We didn't even have to do ecological pest control anymore. We've put away our neem sprays. We've put away all our other ecological methods because we don't need them. The diversity is working to keep pests and diseases totally under control.
I'd like to start by making a comment. This week, it was announced there was a study in Russia, quite preliminary, where female rats were fed genetically modified soy flour beginning 2 weeks before they conceived and then continuing through pregnancy and nursing. And 56% of their offspring died within 3 weeks, compared to 9% of those fed non-genetically modified soy. So I was giving a talk in Tucson last week to a medical association about the risks of genetically engineered foods, and they passed a resolution urging the NIH to follow up the study immediately to see if it's a risk for human health. I wanted to ask you about the BT cotton in India. I've read a lot of your work and others about the failure, and I'm wondering what the current situation is and the overview of the discrepancy perhaps between what Monsanto said that cotton would do and what it actually has done, and what the reactions have been from the farmers and from the government.
BT cotton is the cotton with BT genes introduced into it, and it's one of the two applications of genetically engineered crops. The other is herbicide resistance. India only has BT cotton cultivated commercially so far. The trial started in '98, totally illegally. Monsanto totally bypassed our Environmental Protection Act and our regulations under that act for genetically modified organisms. So I took them to court right away, as a result of which the commercialization was delayed by 3 years. Now, even in the trial period, it was very clear that they were exaggerating the yields, and they were definitely exaggerating the ability of BT to control the bollworm, which is the only pest it's designed to control. But the data showed at the trial level that the other pests and diseases were actually 300 times more. Aphids and jacids, for example, were much higher. So the peasants were actually having to use higher levels of pesticide because of increased pest problems. In the first 2 years, the averages, we've done studies each year in the commercial planting. The Monsanto claims were 1,500 kilograms per acre and 10,000 rupees additional incomes. The averages of yields were 200 kilograms and losses of 6,400 rupees per acre. Now, how, in spite of that level of failure, do they manage to continue to have a market growing? India's BT market is one of the markets that Monsanto is really betting on. First is, one area fails, they just move on to the next. And with large countries like India, there's always another area. This year, the southern state of Andhra Pradesh was forced to tell the government of Delhi that they could not renew the licensing because the crop was failing. We had had riots. Monsanto's offices had been broken into by farmers who were very, very angry in Warangal and Andhra Pradesh. The government of Andhra Pradesh was forced to admit this had been a total failure, as a result of which the varieties were not cleared for southern India, where the trials had been done. They were now cleared for northern India, where the trials had led to the rejection of those varieties. So this year we've had a huge expansion in Punjab. Again, there's been failure. And the way Monsanto deals with it is, when it fails, it just declares, oh, that was spurious seed, that was not ours. But when they're selling the seed, and they sell it very often with government help, because they manage to, get government extension to do their work of moving the seeds. At that time, of course, they're selling the miracle crop, the next miracle. When it fails, it's always a spurious product. So you have not just a total discrepancy between Indian institutions and Monsanto's literature, including Indian agriculture universities, and the Cotton Research Institution just published a very major report showing how unstable BT cotton is. A very, very important report showing how the technology itself is not a reliable technology in keeping the trait of pest control effective. But you also have a discrepancy between an element of the scientific community that Monsanto is able to control. I remember a particular paper published, I think, in Science or Nature, in Science, the Zilberman and Kaim paper, in which they reproduced Monsanto's data. They'd never been to look at the commercial planting. They'd never done field studies. They were handed over the data by Monsanto, and they published a study in Science, and it was published. And that is what is then cited as evidence that this is a success. So, I sometimes say we are up against not just genetic pollution, Jeff, we are up against scientific pollution of a very high level. And of course, political pollution, because without corrupting systems, they would not be able to continuously increase their market. And just as an aside, the US sued the Europeans for not eating GM food. They used the World Trade Organization, that this was interference in free trade, that Europeans not eating GM food was interfering in the right of Monsanto to trade. The decision is done, but they're not announcing it till after the ministerial, because they're absolutely sure the ministerial will not go through. Because if the US loses, then the US will back out of WTO. And if the Europeans lose, they're never ever going to accept an enlargement of that agreement. So the GM issue is very, very much at the heart of international trade, international politics, and increasingly at the heart of blocking more sustainable, more farmer-friendly, and more earth-friendly solutions for the future of agriculture. It's very important. You all must be knowing Jeff. He's published this book called Seeds of Deception, which is the inside story of how GM crops were cleared in this country. And BGH, not just GM crops, but all genetically engineered products. So get his book and read it.
Hi. I have a question. I just wondered, first of all, how much you got to see of the corn landscape of Iowa as you came, corn soy landscape. It's quite a monoculture infrastructure and land use in the state. And I was wondering if you'd seen any sort of monoculture of a comparable scale be significantly transformed back to a more diverse situation.
Well, I think all monocultures can be transformed to diverse situations. It needs the will of people. It needs the access to biodiversity to be able to diversify again, which is why seed savers exchanges are so important, because unless you have that diversity, or the gene pool of diversity, there's no way you can break it. And eventually, in the long run, you need policy, but I don't think to begin with you need policy, because we've had all this celebration of Rosa Parks and what she did by being one woman who continued to sit where she should sit. Yeah? Now, she could have kept saying, okay, I can't do this till they create new laws of racial equality. The point is, when you live in systems that are so structurally perverse, then you have a personal responsibility to make the change. And that is what civil disobedience ends up being, because you disobey an unjust system. But that's a moral imperative for justice. And policy must shift eventually, but even before policy shifts, farmers will have to start doing things that bring diversity back. Producers and consumers will have to join up, because you can't have, agriculture the way it is. It's about everyone eating and some people producing, and unless there's a partnership between the two, an alternative doesn't get created. And that's why the language we are creating, and I chair a commission on the future of food, and we've decided to basically talk about the earth as producer, farmers as primary producers, and consumers as co-producers. Because when they make their choices to go to a local farmer's market, they are helping break the monoculture and create a more diversified agriculture and a more localized agriculture. I don't think there's ever a situation in our condition, in human condition, to say it's too late to do the right thing. It's never too late to do the right thing ecologically, socially, ethically.
Thanks.
I think I enjoyed your presentation. We should try to bring you more often here, just because of the intellectual dialogue. I might disagree with you on many aspects, but I do agree with you on several. And many of the examples you gave about Punjab, I studied there, so I'm very well aware of the water issues. And my question is specifically regarding the water, private versus public ownership. I think historically we have seen, we have tried different models through one civilization over the other. Some of the models which you gave example 500 years back, they worked according to the time when the population base was very small compared to today. Some of the models we have tried today also, especially in the Soviet system. I don't know whether to call that system public or private. We have seen several disasters. Aral Sea is one example. Pollution in the Black Sea is another example. But India's example, like you mentioned, 80% of the water systems are community-based. So that's a very good news, and I hope that was the case in Punjab. We would not have faced similar sort of water problems where farmers kept on pumping water and the water is kind of going really down. But the question is, despite the fact that India's 80% of the water systems are community-based systems, still most of the water supplies in India are totally polluted. What would be your response there?
You know, I already talked about pollution of the atmosphere as being a de facto privatization, a privatization by default without seeking consent of society, without ever doing it in terms of through a law, but getting it done. Pollution of India's water systems are actually the same. I mean, it's not that we don't have air and water pollution laws, we have them. But, you know, there was a period, and there is increasingly now a period where the idea is a common water body or a public water body can be used as a privatized sink by someone in power, usually an industry. And whenever a big industry comes up in any location, it's got the backing of money, and usually with that backing of money, it's got the backing of local decision makers and local politicians. They can turn the purest and most pristine of rivers into a polluted, toxic drain. That has been the real problem. I have worked with communities who've tried to resist it, where communities are organized in effective ways. They're able to reverse some of this kind of pollution. Usually communities by themselves don't get heard because that empty earth kind of thing says, but these aren't people, you know, their voice doesn't count. I left university teaching in 1982, largely to make the voice of our communities count. And I founded the Research Foundation for Science and Technology to do research with disenfranchised communities on ecological issues and their environmental rights. I'll give you 2 examples of where such reversal happened by creative coalitions. One of the worst pollutions that is being caused in the globalized economy, where the pollution burden is outsourced to countries like India, is by shrimp farming. You know, shrimp farming is a very water-intensive and water-polluting industry. And the entire area around the coast, wherever these shrimp farms have come up, the water's finished. And when women, and you know, the coasts have good water, so when women in the coast were having to walk miles to collect water, a group of women got very mad and just broke a shrimp farm, you know, broke the pond. And I was then called in to help generate the kind of data that would justify their case and their action. And we did a series of studies. For every $1 traded in shrimp, it left behind $10 of destruction in the local ecosystem, primarily through the water pollution. We worked together to get a Supreme Court ban on that industry. The World Bank wrote to the government of India and said, we've given you a $500 million loan to promote this industry. You make sure you are able to continue this industry in spite of the High Court order, Supreme Court order. So the government tried to rewrite the laws of the coastal regulation zone. Yeah? We managed to prevent that from happening. You know, they got it through one house, but they couldn't get it through the second house. It's sitting in that kind of situation. So pollution is really an expression of the irresponsible acts of privatization of that which is a common resource and should be used as a public good. And if it was used as a public good, then a polluting industry would have to seek permission and say, you know, this is what we do, this is what activity does. Do you give us permission? Coca-Cola would have to go into communities and say, do you allow us to pump your water? And usually people would say, sorry, we need our water for ourselves. Coca-Cola does set up plants without permission. And as a result of it, communities are fighting them. The case of stopping the pollution and mining in Plachimada, a movement I worked with very closely. Amazing, 3 years, they've had the plant shut. One woman, Mailama, just decided, like Rosa Parks, enough is enough. They cannot steal our water. And she created a movement that has had repercussions throughout India and I guess around the world. So water pollution is not a justification for saying the public systems have failed. It's a proof that privatizing interests enclose the public system, and they need to respect public systems. And if they respected public systems, the public systems would work. Water would not be polluted, rivers would flow.
One last question, please.
How would you suggest implementing organic food into the cafeterias here at Iowa State?
Well, I think every student, whether it's a school or whether it's a university, deserves to have the best of food the earth can produce, and the earth can produce tremendously rich food. I know campuses in California, because I've worked with this group of students for sustainability. They have managed to turn their cafeterias into local organic supply. Yeah. And they're now a coalition that works across all the California campuses. And they organize the students, get in touch with them. They have managed to get these contracts, the Marriott kind of contracts. I'm sure you have a Marriott contract, right? Everyone has these jail companies, prison companies supplying water to. That's what I was told. The companies that get the food contracts for university cafeteria run prisons. They learn how to serve bad food at low cost. Why on earth? Students are supposed to be the most radical, revolutionary edge of every generation. Yeah? So your cafeterias must bring you good food to ensure that everyone else gets good food. It's not that difficult. You've got so much farmland.
Once again, I'd like to thank Dr. Shiva for a wonderful lecture. Thank you all for attending. Please stick around for the reception side.